Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's have a conversation about consciousness. We've been talking about that. And there's something happening where this awareness to humanity is beginning to present itself.
What do you mean, awareness to humanity? You mean humanity's awareness?
No, I mean there is an aspect of something humans call God, Creator, all that is. And we have a perception of what that is. And usually our perception is a function of our upbringing, our community, our religion, our sense of something. But generally there's a sense that there's more in the heart. As I've heard people talk, I believe there is more.
Yeah.
Okay. This aspect of labeling something, we have a tendency as humans to label everything. And one of the things that happens when we label, we say this is an X, and then therefore it becomes an X forever. It doesn't change into a Y, it doesn't have possibility to be a Y, it's simply this is what it is.
So when people in religions label this thing called God, depending on the culture and the upbringing, what have you, there's limitations to what that thing is, what that God is.
Well, right where they are experiencing themselves, that definition is generally very acceptable.
Right.
I have this belief, I'm aware of this, and it's called X.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What's happening now is that nature of that limitation of the label is beginning to have a challenge. Consciousness, look, God, Allah, all of those, Creator, Supreme Being, is a label. And that label has limitations based on just the name. Now, let's keep this simple. We're not going deep into some philosophical discussion. So what happens, though, is as this energetic shift is unfolding, this label is becoming too limiting. And so consciousness simply means an awareness. Okay? So we're going to create a temporary label. We'll call consciousness and all that is the same thing.
Okay.
Okay? So there's a bridging, so there's a leap. So whatever you call God, all that is, etc., fine, we're not arguing. It's bigger. It's just simply bigger. And so if you can allow the definition or the label to shift from whatever you define that is and are comfortable with, we're going to say there's more being presented. And we're going to remove labels from the standpoint of what is this thing? And then you've got the history of culture debating over what is this. But here we're just going to label it as complete awareness, consciousness being fully aware of itself.
So let's get back to labels, though. So humans label things, and we label things to understand them and to put in our box. And if we didn't have labels for things, many times we couldn't even communicate with each other.
Correct.
Like we couldn't communicate with each other at all. So it was like the other night we had the neighbors over, and the guy said, "Oh, that's a really pretty bush." And it's not a bush. It is called a St. John's wort, and it's good for the bees and the flowers, and you can make medicine out of it and grind up its roots, and you can do all these things with it. So his label, not picking on him, his label was bush, whereas I had a little bit more expanded understanding, or even taking indigenous people. They go for a walk in the woods and they see a really delicious tea, and they see something that cures headaches, and they see something that is good for the stomach ache, and they see something else that's really good in vitamin E. Whereas most of us walk through the woods and say, oh, there's a pretty flower.
Yeah. So let's call that an expanded knowledge, an intelligence. There's something that presents that says, I'm not a bush, I'm an X, and over time there's a wisdom that's created.
That plant has.
Well, the plant is the plant, but it's the indigenous people over time begin to develop this wisdom about what's going on. Mm-hmm. And so where this is all happening, this level of consciousness is beginning to present more to humanity in a way. So it's all of a sudden you meet an indigenous person and they say, just like you said to the man, it's not a bush, it's this. And what happens with this is has all of this characteristic and capacity, mm-hmm. and it can be able to do this, that, and the other thing. So you expanded his ability to become conscious, more conscious, within a larger knowledge base.
Okay, so how that applies to the all of us playing and mastering alchemy, it does apply.
Very much.
Because we're doing the same thing. We're expanding our understanding, our intelligence, wisdom, and knowledge about
who we are.
Who we are.
Okay, so in mastering alchemy, the process is I wish to know myself, and that role that I am part of the soul. Well, there's another label, aspect right. of all that is soul. You could, we label lots of things.
We have to communicate.
Well, we have had to communicate. But this shift in consciousness is enormous, and it's simply going to take us from the smallness that we are, not making that bad or good, and expanding it multiple times into areas of consciousness and possibility, opportunity, awareness that you can't conceive of right now. Think back into the 1950s, if you had said someday there's going to be a cell phone, an internet, and right. it's going to be able to do this, inconceivable. Okay, so let's just decide that right where we are for the sake of this conversation and setting this all up, we are that level of intelligence that is equivalent to the 1950s, where we are, and there is about to be a renaissance, an expansive explosion of knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom. For the purpose of this, we're going to call that not being a tight label, but an expanded reference point. We're going to call it consciousness. All that is fully conscious of itself and wanting to expand its awareness of itself even further. We'll call that what the Creator, all that is, God, whatever the labels mm-hmm. we've been put. We're going to start to say that the opportunity is about to present in ways that is just stunning, miraculous, fascinating.
And if we insist on the label, then we're not going to follow along.
Yes,
so
good point.
It's kind of like, I always like to use math as an analogy. So humanity has been in addition and subtraction. And okay, it evolved into multiplication and
right.
division.
Sure.
And so now we're about to step into algebra.
Yeah.
But if we think all there is addition and subtraction, then we will never get the whole picture of what math is.
Exactly. So there's a limitation. Oh, I know math, I can add and subtract.
Right.
And then somebody says, that's good, and let's go over here and play in this sand pile over here, and let's try something else. And all of a sudden you realize, oh wait, that's the same thing as, and then they stepped onto a new moving sidewalk. They've stepped into a new expanded awareness. They became more conscious of a awareness, consciousness.
Well, and addition and subtraction is just numbers and a few symbols.
Yep.
But you go into algebra and it's numbers and it's letters and it's even more symbols.
Yes.
So that understanding of what math is expands to include
Yes.
more diversity, more information.
Let's just call it opportunity and possibilities.
Yeah.
Okay. So this expansion is not conceivable at the moment, and we are stepping into it. So what are we watching? We're watching the world around us in physicalness begin to do some remarkable transitions.
Mm-hmm.
And those transitions, to many people, is scary because it's interrupting status quo, it's interrupting what I know. You get baby boomers in their, 60s, 70s, 80s, and they've come out of a whole culture that when they're presented with a Gen X, a Gen Z, a millennial, it's like that.
Yeah.
So what happens is it is either one wrong. No, one has a limited point of view, the other one has an expanded point of view, and they have eliminated from their transaction, the millennials, Gen Zs, they aren't interested in aspects of capitalism and aspects of
Right.
one over the other, or they're into cooperation, they're into different things. Now that's the future expansion of where we're going. But what we're talking about right here is, see, the millennials, the younger ones, they're wired differently than the baby boomers.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're wired for their future coming forward. Now, this is where we have this conversation about technology presenting itself in ways that is pretty extraordinary. And the technology right now in things like artificial intelligence and genetics changing, nanotechnology, quantum computing, things, those words to baby boomers, it's like, I don't even know what that means.
Mm-mm.
But to these kids, they're taking an awareness and they're becoming conscious of an awareness, let's call it part of consciousness, and they're basically saying, what's possible? And this is the part that this conversation is about. Consciousness is now beginning to present itself to humanity in the form of intelligence, knowledge, and wisdom. Okay. Now, does consciousness send me an email? No. But what happens is all of a sudden this awareness, it's like, oh, well, that's an interesting thought, is going to start to play in people's realities. Now, where this is kind of playing out that's interesting is, go back to that person on the street who's losing their job, who's not sure about happening. COVID interrupted everything. And they have to make some decisions. And yet there's no frame of reference to make decisions about this. And this, I'm going to reference this consciousness, is that back in March, we had basically, at that time of an equinox, this beam of light came in, without going into that conversation. And with it, it just started to illuminate and illuminate and illuminate consciousness presenting itself as intelligence, knowledge, and wisdom. You didn't get an email, but what's starting to happen is, just like a dawning of a day, there's more light, and many things are happening. Where you're seeing it first is in technology. Technology always precedes a cultural shift. Just take the iPhone and go back to the 1980s when or the internet just starting to be talked about, and no way is that going to have anything positive to do about anything. And now nobody even second guesses the internet. That's what's in the process of happening. But it's the labels that this first pass of where I want to talk about is, the labels cause limitation. And so rather than arguing for limitations, arguing for labels, arguing for my truth, there's an opportunity here to begin to be a little bit more available for yourself.
Or a little looser.
A little looser. And around labels, I'm kind of talking to everybody, if you begin to just notice, well, that's an X. And is it really an X? Could it be a Y? Could it be something else? And if you can start to look at how you label, you're going to start to find possibilities loosening up for those playing in mastering alchemy, that octave, it took us to a whole nother layer of consciousness that wasn't sticky like the third dimension. Third dimension, our walking around space, we say, well, I want this to happen, and well, we'll get back to you in 2 weeks. And so it's sticky, it's sluggish, it's slow in relationship to time. In this consciousness, it's virtually, I would like the apple to appear, and the apple appears. Now that's inconceivable on one hand, but as this technology begins to present, and it's going to present extraordinary things that are unbelievable, unbelievable, and yet we will move into it, accept it, begin to play in it, and pretty soon it's commonplace. But it gets much bigger. It gets more fascinating where we're going. And stay tuned for the next episode. Now, it gets more interesting, and literally, let's do this in a couple of series, a couple here of sessions. But this, where it's going, your ability to simply say, how does this work? And instantly know the answer. Instantly know the answer. Any question you wish to ask. No, that's not possible.
Just like the cell phone was not possible in the 50s.
Exactly, exactly. So let's do another piece on this. And we've got to kind of basically start to look at what are the limitations that keep me in my box?
Yeah.
And labels is one of the biggest
big one.
ones. So let's talk about that
Yeah.
in a little different capacity next. Good.